g5, but that still at this moment runs into d4. So that's one of the reasons why this isn't as effective as queen f6.
And a queen trade would be also a psychological blow to Pragg, who I think was just ready to attack, right? He was in that frame of mind where I'm going to tear this guy apart. I'm going to use my queen and generate chances against Black's king. Suddenly adjusting yourself to a slightly worse endgame, going from, a one-sided attack to a long and arduous defensive task in the endgame is very, very onerous from a psychological standpoint. So queen f6 is asking to be played, and he plays it. And this is a very difficult moment for the Indian talent. Will he trade queens? Will he stubbornly drop back to g4? This is not really a choice, Peter. He has to trade, and he has to accept the new reality.
Yeah, which is very unpleasant. Then he will be kicking himself of investing 5 minutes on king h1 and missing Black's idea of queen f6. This is a cold shower now for Pragg. And the point is that, yes, now after queen g4, knight takes f5, there is nothing to talk about, because after e4, I guess that now even the forcing knight e3 works perfectly, making sure that white doesn't have any queen moves at all. The knight is hitting also the rook. And one of the lines that Computer was highlighting with white's rook on e1 was that white can count on some idea like rook d6, but for that idea, it was essential to have that rook on e1, eyeing the e5 pawn already. Here, Black would just trade that intruder easily with rook d8, and Black is just a very healthy pawn up. So I don't see another way of playing with white rather than trading queens, and Pragg takes his time. It's clear that he is shocked that queen f6 was possible.
And every second that ticks away from his clock is a second that he could be spending trying to find the ideal defensive setup in the endgame. And I think that any defensive setup is connected to the move e3, e4. I think we will see that move. Probably he will take on g6 first. And of course, Carlsen can recapture several different ways. Then I think Pragg will advance his pawn to e4 and try to increase the influence of his bishop, and also to restrict the knight on e7 and prevent it from jumping to f5 and harassing that e3 pawn. How would you assess Magnus Carlsen's chances in this endgame? There's no doubt that Black is probably the one pushing for a win here, but is it, 90-10? Is it 70-30 in Carlsen's favor? What's going through his mind right now?
I think that first of all, he's just very happy what happened here in the last couple of moves. He's relieved. At some point, like 15 minutes ago, it looked like he has a very tough position. Pragg has the initiative. Pragg is up on the clock. And yeah, Pragg had to go for f take g6. Now Magnus takes h take g6, clearly capturing towards the center. And I perfectly agree with you that somehow e4 is kind of the move that you want to play, because if you play e4 followed by rook a1, then eventually Black's pawn on e5 will be quite vulnerable. White will have e takes d5 ideas, and it's not so easy to move that knight from e7. So there's a big question, like after e4, is Black even potentially considering a trade on e4 and say that, you know what, yes, it's already on the board. Let me refresh. FG8G, E4, white is fighting for the center. And all eyes on Magnus. That does he bring the rook to d8, which gives white the chance to eventually target the e5 pawn? Or is he releasing the tension but make sure that he fixes the structure?
And Carlsen has shown, throughout his career, a propensity to keep the tension in the center and to try to generate problems by making the position more complex. I think rook ad8 is right in his wheelhouse. On the other hand, if Carlsen wants to play with an abundance of caution, if he wants to say, listen, I know that I've got some chances here, but let me eliminate all risk first, then he will be more tempted to take on e4. And that is exactly what he does. D takes e4 on the board. It doesn't mean that Magnus isn't playing for a win. The position is still exceedingly dangerous for white. And he's also asking Pragg a very unpleasant question, Peter. And white's down to 9 minutes. Every one of these questions is going to take more time off of white's clock. What is this question? Well, what are you going to take on e4 with? And it's not a given that pawn takes e4 is the best move, but Pragg plays it. He wants to keep his knight and he wants to keep active possibilities connected with the knight jumping to c4 and targeting both a5 and e5. I like that decision from Pragg.
I think this was very important. If he would have traded the knights with knight e4, he could have been in for a very unpleasant defensive task. Now d takes e4, exactly because this vulnerable e5, a5 pawns, I believe that it should just be enough to keep the balance. And the good news is that that knight on e7 is still completely stuck. Imagine that this knight from e7 could jump to c5. You would be saying that black is almost winning. That's the nuance we are talking about in this position. Black's other idea of eventually going knight d7, knight c5, it's also too slow. White only needs one move to get his knight to c4.
The atmosphere of this game is so intense. We've got over 120,000 watching on YouTube. A huge, huge shout out to everybody taking time out of your busy days and watching this epic 2023 World Cup final. This is the first rapid play match game. They will play a second game with the same time control with colors reversed. But obviously, if Magnus Carlsen can deal the first blow with the black pieces, Pragg will have to beat Magnus on demand with black. But I really, really like the fact that Pragg took on e4 quickly. He left himself with 9 minutes. He left himself with a lot of time to figure out the ideal defensive setup. And if he defends with the precision that he has displayed in endgames in previous matches, I think he should be able to hold the draw here.
Yes, I also think so, but I also get some information that apparently Fabiano has a great chance. Let's get the bird's eye view.
Wow. Basov's position is in shambles.
Yeah, now that we know that the Magnus game is a little bit slow and the situation has calmed down, this gave us a good chance to catch up. Look at that gorgeous bishop on e5, the dark squares, White's bishop on b3 completely out of the game. It's a wonderful situation for black.
It's a very one-sided position. Caruana brings his a-pawn up 2 squares. We don't even have to look more carefully at that game. It looks like Caruana has everything under control. The only alarming factor is his clock. He's down to 6 minutes. So having updated the first game of the third place matchup, let's dive back into Pragg against Carlsen because it's becoming more intense, right? The clock situation is dwindling. Carlsen now below 7 minutes as he decides between the various candidate moves. What are those candidate moves? Well, rook 8 to d8 is the most obvious, but you also pointed out that c5 square. And you can't get the e7 knight to c5 efficiently, but you can bring the other knight over through d7 to c5. But Carlsen has opted for the more concrete option. He's gone rook a d8, and he's hit Pragg's knight on d2.
Yes, I think that this is a very natural move because after knight c4, which kind of we most probably expect. On the other hand, White can also maybe try to keep the tension, but I do feel maybe that knight c4 is more natural. But what I wanted to say that after knight c4, Magnus takes on e4, and once you eliminate that e4 pawn, suddenly the knight from e7 comes to life. Black will have options to go knight d5 or knight f5, depending which pawn White is taking. Suddenly black gets a lot of activity. That's one of the most important things in rapid chess. So the move rook a d8, practically a very wise choice.
Indeed. So knight c4, tempting, but perhaps keeping the e4 pawn alive is even more important. And to keep it alive, you have to keep the knight on d2. To keep the knight on d2, you have to defend it. And to defend it, you have to bring the rook up from f1 to f2. There's also the move rook a to d1, but somehow, just intuitively, that strikes me as a lot more awkward. Now, rook f2, it does run into knight f6 to g4, but then the rook could slide over to e2, and you could chase that knight out of g4 with h3. So it's a little bit hard to play this move, but Pragg does it again. Very precise defensive skill. Rook f2 was a very important move to keep black's initiative at bay.
Yes, super important. Making sure that the knight from e7 is not yet reaching. There is also another argument that now after rook f2, it's clear that White will have some trouble moving that knight from d2 to c4 because knight takes d4 might come with a tempo. And for this reason, there are some ideas like going knight c8, knight d6. But hang on, knight c8 might run into rook a f1. Isn't white threatening to hit that knight on f6? And let's not forget about the bishop on b3. There is still the pressure on the f7 pawn as well.
Yeah, Mount Krakatoa there could erupt on f7 with 3 pieces attacking that pawn. Such an easy detail to blunder because you think you're out of the woods with the queens off the board. You're never out of the woods when you're playing a player of Pragnananda's caliber. So knight c8, rook a f1. It leads to some crazy tactics there because black can play knight to g4 and try to exploit the weakness of white's first rank. But is Magnus interested in this kind of confrontation? No, he's not. And he's played rook d4, but what happens if Pragg still plays the move rook a to f1? What's the idea here?
Well, basically there are 2 ideas. He can rely on the defense knight e7 to g8, which is a stabilizing move. Or is he planning to go for adventure with knight xe4? I don't think it's not Magnus's style to go for such tacticals. Exactly, knight e7 to g8 on the board.
But how is he going to untangle? Does he want to play b5 and expand on the queen side? Let's say Pragg plays a neutral move like h3. And h3 isn't even a neutral move. You're preparing to storm the g-pawn up to g5 and kick the knight out of f6. Carlsen cannot afford to lose the f7 pawn with check. What is Magnus's intended way of untangling on the king side? Is it rook d7?
It's a big question, yes. I like the move h3, but first Pragg kicks the rook away. Nice little touch, c3, so black most probably falls back to d7, yes, on the board already.
Now rook e2 deserves attention, freeing up the knight and preparing knight c4. And he's done it. Great play by Pragg here these last couple of moves. It feels like suddenly he's the one who's largely out of the woods here.
Definitely has improved his position. The knight is threatening to jump to c4. If black plays the move b5, which stops knight c4, then white can suddenly start rerouting his knight to f3, hitting that e5 pawn. And if black has to keep on somehow defending that e pawn with rook e8 or rook e7, white's knight might even land on g5, inserting some more pressure on the f7 pawn.
It really feels like Carlsen did not squeeze the maximum out of this endgame in the last couple of moves, but all credit to Pragg. He has once again kept his composure, and he's also kept a time advantage, right? He's rebuilt those extra 2 minutes on the clock, and Carlsen probably will go b7, b5 in order to cover the c4 square. He might also deploy his rook from f8 and stack it on d8, but then once again, you have to start worrying about the long-term weakness of the f7 pawn and knight c4, which is a big problem.
Yes, I somehow feel like b5 is the natural follow-up, and b5, knight f3, I would even go rook e7. I somehow sense that Magnus's idea was with this knight e7 to g8 to somehow set up this strategical idea of eventually moving that knight from f6 to d7 and the knight from g8 jumping to f6, and he has done it instantly. He goes rook e7.
And knight c4, that is begging to be played. It hits the a5 pawn. Will Magnus initiate crazy tactics there with b5? Again, that's not really congruent with his style. Magnus trying to keep things relatively tactics-free in this endgame. Does that mean he is preparing to meet knight c4 with rook a8?
Probably, but it's extremely strange. There is this potential weakness on f7. Yes, the rook on e7 is protecting that pawn, but something tells me that this is very risky. I don't see yet the follow-up, but white's knight might be able to get to d6. Then, of course, Magnus will kick that knight away with rook d8. I'm a little bit puzzled by Magnus's choices.
It's not entirely unlikely that we get some sort of repetition of moves, right? Both players might end up being happy with a draw in this first game. From Pragg's perspective, he's already survived a scare at the start of this endgame. Magnus Carlsen's scare came earlier in the middle game. But will Pragg suddenly say, hey, your pieces are mighty passive all of a sudden. I'm up a minute on the clock. Let me try to press on the gas pedal. Big question. Whether Pragg will play knight c4, I think the answer is likely yes. But he could also make a slower improving move, like king h1 over to g1, or h3. So he's got quite a few of those improving moves in reserve that he can play if he wants to wait for Magnus to put his cards on the table. And he makes one of those moves. Bishop drops back to c2, overprotecting the e4 pawn.
That's a little bit of a surprise because we kind of talked about the pressure on the f7 pawn. On the other hand, probably Pragg has sensed that black has enough defenses. Knight d7 played. Exactly, Magnus is trying to reroute his knights. But is it not the right time to jump knight c4? Attacking that pawn, and now it's a different story because after rook a8, we might be able to jump knight d6. Black isn't able to kick that knight immediately out of the game, and if you follow up with the natural knight c5, we might be able to start asking some question to that pawn on f7. Very interesting endgame on the board.
On the board, knight c4 and rook a8. Although even in that final position we were analyzing, black's rook could go from a8 back to f8. I'm just not seeing, how Pragg can do more than ask questions. He can pose threats to the f7 pawn and to the b7 pawn, but it feels like Magnus has enough defensive firepower to keep everything at bay. I think the likeliest outcome here is a draw, but the situation getting more tense with every passing second. Both sides are now under 5 minutes. So this is, at this point, the equivalent of a blitz game.
Yes, and I also feel there is so much tension in the position because, yes, it does look like it's an end game. Things have stabilized. Long terms, black can still be better if black somehow gets knight gf6, knight c5 in, and white is unable to use the moment for active counterplay. Then slowly, black will start to take over. It's a typical kind of peer defense. Yeah, it's long-term issues. Black has this lovely pawn structure if he coordinates forces. Then after all, let's not forget that white has 3 pawn islands and black only has 2, and the knights will work beautifully together.
And Magnus has already converted a couple of slight advantages in the endgame in typical Magnus style. He did it on demand against Vincent Keimer to win the second match game and force a Raipa tiebreak. He did it in the second match game against Vasily Ivanchuk in a position that many thought would end surely in a draw. That would have won him the match. But the fact remains, Carlsen has shown a lot of endgame prowess in this tournament. Pragg, he knows that he cannot relax. He cannot make a couple of lazy moves and give Carlsen's knights more activity. And g4, what a committal decision by Pragg. The engine doesn't like it. He's trying to drive the pawn up to g5 and restrict the knight on g8. But what if Carlsen drops into f6 and hits that pawn?
Yes, and provokes g5, then the knight jumps to h5. Suddenly, there will be a very lovely spot on f4. Clearly, Pragg relies on some knight takes e5 tactic that the knight on f4 will not be able to sit there forever, but then black might get the e5 square for the other knight. Strategically, this is a very committal decision.
And after knight gf6, the knight could actually drop back to h7 and then either backward to f8 or forward to g5 and eventually try to plant itself on f4. But Magnus, he plays pawn to f6 rather than knight f6. That is a huge surprise to me.
A very big surprise. Basically, I feel that it plays into white's hand. Clearly, Magnus is hoping to go knight h6 and knight f7.
g5.
Exactly, and Pragg jumps on the possibility. He instantly played the move rook g2, making sure that he will be able to meet knight h6 with g5.
A very risky move, followed by an incredibly alert reaction by Pragg. Knight h6 is met with g5, and you need to play it now, because if the knight gets back to f7, then black institutes that clamp on the g5 square. And the worst case scenario for white is if you allow that knight to reach f4. That is the promised land. You have to open up the position in order to prevent that from happening. This position is going to keep sharpening up, especially if Pragg carries out the g5 pawn break, which seems very likely given what he's just played.
Exactly, I think this is what he had in his mind when he opted for g4. Can we talk about mutual hallucination or believing each other that the possibility of knight g8 to f6 was somehow missed by both players? Sometimes in the heat of the battle it can happen. and f6 rook g2 on the board. Now white has everything under control. One can forget about g4 being a question mark. G4 was a very good move if black had to play the move f6.
And Magnus can't stop the progress of the pawn by playing g5 himself, because the medicine is way worse than the disease. That would create a massive hole on f5. White could play knight d6 or knight e3, and knight d6 would carry a double attack on the b7 pawn and the f5 square. So Magnus will have to allow Pragg to open up the king side with g5. He's investing a lot of time here. He's down to 2.5 minutes, and he finally decides on knight h6. Pragg very likely to play g5 here and launch an all-out assault on that g6 pawn, which will be made a lot more vulnerable by the fact that the g-file will open up.
Yeah, however he's posing, he's not blitzing out. We assume that he will be very happy that he gets the chance of playing g5. And g5, f takes g5, rook takes g5, knight f7, that's the move that also gives black a lot of stability. The knight comes with a tempo, hits the rook on g5, and the rook falls back to g3. As you indicated, there will be a pressure on the g6 pawn. Also, this knight d6, knight f5 ideas are there, but things are heating up. g5 on the board.
Yep. And we have that position. Takes, and knight f7. As you were just showing, Peter, the or g5, and it drops back to g2. And I thought that rook g3 made a little bit more sense, but maybe Pragg trying to bring his rook all the way back away from the influence of black's knights.
Yeah, rook g3 looked a bit more natural, but okay, if you are in blitz mode, rook e6 played by Magnus as well, making sure that the d6 square is beautifully protected by the knight on f7, rook on e6. The rook also protects the pawn on g6, and eventually setting up this very nice little rook f6. We have already seen the move queen f6, which had such a big impact on the game. I do believe that rook f6, also combined with some knight f8 defending the g6 pawn, is a wonderful rerouting for black.
The initiative has changed hands several times in this endgame, but that doesn't mean it can't change hands again. Pragg now down to 2.5 minutes. And if black's knights get active, there is still that f4 square, there is still the d-file, and there is still the rook on a8, which has not made its presence felt just yet. But if Pragg takes his foot off the gas pedal and he lets black's knights get active, it's so hard to deal with a pair of active knights in time pressure. The move bishop b3 comes to mind, but case in point, you might be running into potentially knight d7 to c5. Although there are some tactics with rook takes f7 and knight takes e5. All of that has to be calculated carefully. And Pragg now under 2 minutes. You can sense the anxiety. Both players locked in concentration.
Yeah, very critical moment. It's if someone just looks at the evaluation bar and sees 0-0, he does not get the sense, the real feel for this position. This position has so much spice. There is so lot of finesses. Very crucial decisions for both sides in the next couple of moves.
Rook d2 hitting the knight directly. The knight can move, but Carlsen could also meet fire with fire. He could slide his rook to f6 nonetheless, and he does. And he offers an exchange of rooks that seems to be in black's favor.
Sensational play. Basically, rook e6 was connected with this rook f6. He had to force it at the rook move, rook d2, which hits the knight. Will be met by rook f6. Everything else would have run into some tactical issues. Amazing play by Magnus.
And Pragg now down to a minute on the clock. He's suddenly down 2 minutes, which could become really important as this endgame continues to sharpen up. White has several ways to keep the rooks on the board. He can double on the d-file. He can play rook f to d1, but then you have to reckon with the black knight getting super active on c5, and white's king is not entirely safe. The rook from a8 could later on, it could slide to the h-file and start exerting pressure on h2. 40 seconds for Praggnanandhaa as he exchanges rooks, tries to simplify the position, and I like that decision.
I think it was the correct call. It's not about fighting for initiative. You just have to make sure that in time trouble with 40 seconds on the clock, you have things under control. Maybe even go b4. Yes, b4
Excellent
on the board.
Move. He is trying to simplify things by force. Exchange pawns, make this position easier to play, easier to handle with less than a minute on the clock. And Peter, he's built up 20 very important seconds with his last two moves.
Yeah, creates counterplay, also signals Magnus that, you still have that b7 pawn, and if I gonna get the pawn to a5, if I ever take that pawn on b7, then the a pawn will be way too powerful. This puts Magnus also on alert. I don't think that he can afford to play for the initiative. It might be that it's a dynamic balance.
And if he plays the move b5 himself, he runs into knight to b6 followed by a5. So it's entirely possible for Black to lose control of this game. And I love Pragg's last move, b2, b4, remaining on top and creating practical pressure on Black's queen side as Carlsen reroutes his king toward the center.
Yeah, he's probably setting up ideas like king e7, rook d8, trying to trade rooks. Is that a possibility, or is he thinking that if I have the king on e7, making sure that the anti-squares d7, d6 are well covered, then maybe I will be able to activate my rook on the h file? Is he hoping for some counterplay?
And Pragg
Very
doing
tense.
the same. He brings his own king up toward the center and maybe trying to overprotect the e4 pawn with king f3. First, he plays a5, fixing the queenside pawns, fixing the pawn on b7 for a rainy day. And Carlsen, we mentioned this move earlier. He brings his rook to the other side of the board, and he's starting to exert pressure on Pragg's king side. That rook can dive into h4 and hit e4, and Black's knights are rearing to get even more active. This could get out of control for Pragg, who's down to 20 seconds now on the clock.
Yeah,
He's
under
hesitating.
some pressure. Yeah, it's never easy to start defending something with little time
10
on the
seconds. He's got to move, and he does get 10 seconds added to his clock per move, but the situation starting to deteriorate just a little bit. Knight h5. Uh-oh, and the knight getting to f4. This is getting scary for Pragg.
The king g2 move was very unfortunate. Now he has to sidestep from the fork. King g1 played.
Knight f4, Magnus sensing the moment, and the other knight can jump into g5, creating fork threats, maybe even some mate threats in some situations. Uh-oh.
Just in a couple of... And Pragg down to 8 seconds.
And look at the speed with which Carlsen is moving. Every piece becoming more and more active. The rook coming into h3. It can drive into c3. And suddenly there are all these forks that Pragg has to keep in mind. He's got 6 seconds. And a6, a very panicky reaction as he gives up a pawn.
Yeah, it is a panicky reaction because knight a5 can be met by rook c3. Also, bishop a4 can be met by rook c3, knight g5. All this combination of forces seem too much to handle.
Knight g5 might be crushing because if white takes on e5, Black's king just moves up to e6, forces the knight out of e5, and then knight f3 will fork the rook and the king. And Magnus doesn't see it. He plays rook c3, but knight g5 now is even stronger. And he plays it. And this is almost over.
This is over, yes, because knight takes c6 can be met by rook takes c6, bishop c6, knight f3 fork. Pragg in a lot of trouble.
Knight f3, the knights are running amok. White's counterplay on the queen side has not amounted to anything. And Carlsen has left himself with 3 whole minutes on the clock to figure out the last couple of touches here. Black is completely winning here, but Pragg will continue to fight until the last drop of blood. He tries to get the rooks off the board, but Carlsen can play rook a3, and there's got to be some sort of a checkmating mechanism here. Knight h3 and rook a3 wins the game. It wins a piece.
Exactly. And Magnus pauses because he knows exactly that, yes, this is it. Let me just be precise. And yes, on the board, knight g5 to h3 check. No matter where white is going, king f1 or king h1 will have the same problem that rook a3 will follow with a double attack on the bishop and rook a1 checkmate. The knights, just monster knights.
And it took Carlsen so much time and so much finesse to get those knights to where they are. It took a lot of turnarounds and the initiative changed hands. But Carlsen laughs last, and he will laugh longest in this first game. He will just move his king to f6, getting away from the checks. And the threat of rook a1 checkmate and rook takes a4 forces Pragg to resign the first game. And you can see there a dejected Pragg will not have a lot of time to marinate on this game because he has a task in front of him, and that is to win the next game with the black pieces, Peter.
Yeah, it's a mammoth task. We have to give credit for Magnus sensationally sensing the moment, and that King March with King F8, King E7 prepared his activation of his rook, and once the rook activated itself, then the knights were jumping. What a big victory for Magnus Carlsen.
There's a reason he is often called the greatest endgame player of all time. The way that he's able to seize the initiative, to apply practical pressure, nobody can handle that when Magnus is in the best form. Pragg playing such a good game. This could have gone either way. And while Pragg fans will be disappointed, he played excellently. And this game came down to the final time scramble. He will have to win the next game to force the Blitz playoffs. You can see Fabiana Caruana also won the game with the black pieces. And Nijat Abasov in a similar predicament to Pragnananda. Two Herculean tasks will have to be put together, Peter, by Abasov and, of course, by Pragg.
First of all, they have to forget what happened in the first game. That's the step number one, the most important one. Clearly, very difficult. They have like 10 minutes break between the games. Also, they need to adjust their strategy because they were definitely counting on with white will at least make a draw, and with black we want to be solid. That's not the case anymore. They will have to make crazy decisions in the opening and try to go for the maximum right from the start.
With a draw or a victory, Magnus Carlsen wins his first World Cup, and Pragnananda's incredible run will come to an end. He will have to settle for runner-up, but that is only one possible reality. With a victory, with the black pieces, Pragg and Abasov will force this match to keep going. There's only one way to find out which of these narratives, which of these storylines we will be telling after the next game. A huge shout out. We had around 200,000 of you watching across the platforms, and the best part is yet to come. We will have the second game of the Rapid Tiebreaker coming for you on the other side of the break. But first, we're going to take a couple of minutes. When we come back, we will set the stage for the second and possibly decisive game of the 2023 World Cup.
Welcome, everyone. We are here with Judith Polgar, the legendary chess player, one of the greatest chess players of all time.
And I went my next move. I said, no, I'm not moving my queen. I'm not moving my bishop. But actually, I'm going to give checkmate or winning great material. And I went knight e3. It works only that way. If you're an attacker, you sacrifice something, go all the way until the end. Don't chicken out in the meantime at some point, because many times there is a point there is no way back. It's only forward. How is it to play with Kasparov? When you saw him personally, he really had this incredible energy.
Judith, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you're ready to dive into the past with us.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very happy to share with you some of my most memorable games.
1 minute, 10 seconds. Every second counts.
Hikaru Nakamura is surviving.
We're rookie 8. Whoa! Queen. He blundered his queen. He's got 40 more seconds. He needs to burn. Rookie's losing. Oh my god, he's gonna flag! No!
He flagged! He flagged! He flagged!
Oh my god! He made him!
Oh my god! Strong stairway! Oh, get over the board!
He's just gonna move quickly.
Oh! Oh my gosh!
Welcome to the final day of action at the 2023 FIDE World Cup. Today, possibly in only a couple of minutes, a winner will be determined. One game, one draw, or one win stands between Magnus Carlsen and his first ever World Cup victory. Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky, Grandmaster Peter Leko chopping it up for you today on this epic final day of action that culminates a month-long tournament in which so many players tried their hand, shot their shot, but only one winner will emerge, possibly after the next game. Peter, let's not sugarcoat it. The task in front of Pragg is Herculean. He's been here before. He lost the first match game against his compatriot Arjun Erigaisi with white. He was in trouble against Fabiano Caruana. But this is a task of entirely different magnitude, to defeat Magnus Carlsen with black on demand.
Certainly. On the other hand, he has done it against Arjun Erigaisi. That will give him confidence. The big question already for me, is Magnus gonna play 1e4? Does he stick to e4? Because definitely we're gonna see Pragg answer that with c5. No e5, no symmetry. And there is another question, like 1d4 kind of option is also very tempting, just to make sure that your opponent doesn't get those unbalanced positions that Pragg is familiar with in the Sicilian, but not exactly against d4. I think he has a very solid, good repertoire with black, but doesn't have too much experience of gambling.
And in order to defeat Magnus Carlsen, I'm recusing myself from this conversation. I have no idea how to do that. But the famous quote by Alexander Alekin comes to mind. And he said that to defeat me, you have to beat me 3 times, in the opening, in the middle game, and in the end game. And I think Pragg realizes that he has to break this task down into its component parts. And the first component part is to get an unbalanced position out of the opening. The second is to develop an initiative in the middle game. And then the third is to break down Magnus Carlsen's stalwart resistance. This will be an incredibly difficult task, but Pragg has demonstrated supreme confidence. He's demonstrated a lot of patience, and he's demonstrated universality. He has shown that he can skillfully play virtually any type of position. So if anybody can do it, then it probably is Pragg in the form that he is currently in. But he's not the only one who will have to win on demand. Nijat Abasov lost his first game in crushing style to Fabiano Caruana, and he too will have to win the second game with black on demand. Peter, we focused on the Carlsen-Pragg game, and for good reason, but since we have a couple of minutes before the start of the second match game, perhaps we can quickly review what happened in Nijat's game.
Yeah, we actually missed all the action. Wow, what?
Whoa, oh, knight c6. What is this?
Exactly. That's what I'm also thinking about. Look at this, and e3, e5, Fabiano coming up with some very interesting new idea, clearly also surprising his opponent. d5, knight e7. That's how things got completely out of control right at the start.
And he gives up the bishop pair, and it looks totally justified, Peter, because you're ruining black's pawn structure. But there is this very typical plan here where black fixes the center with d6 and then starts expanding on the king side with f6, f5. And I feel like, practically speaking, these types of positions where black possesses the bishop pair and kind of a big pawn phalanx on the king side are practically difficult to play. And perhaps even objectively, it looks like white is already worse. And the situation just did not get any better for Abasov, who completely lost control of the center. He got that weak pawn on d5. Caruana started to expand on the other side of the board, and he did not catch a break the rest of the game.
Yes, this b5, queen a5, and things escalated on the queen side. Black's bishop on e5 will have a lovely square. I think this is what we witnessed. Yeah, this was the position when we joined in. It looked very promising for black. Queen b4 setting up the decisive a5, a4, breaking white's construction on the queen side. Rook c2, a5, rook cf2, rook takes c3. Wow,
oh,
beautiful
what a combination.
Yes, yes. Let me just show that b takes c3 runs into queen h4, winning material, punishing white's rook on f2. Sensational stuff by Fabiano.
Such a smooth game, and Nijat Abasov was forced to resign a couple of moves later, trying to mix things up, but to no avail. Caruana's attack, coupled with his material advantage, turned decisive, and after winning white's rook, Nijatabasov put his king down. What a game by Caruana. What a game by Carlsen. And this match will determine the third place finisher. Before we get to our second match game in Pragg Carlsen, we wanted to remind you really quickly that on Monday, August 28th, you will not want to miss the exciting match between two of the brightest stars in young chess. Tanya Dewumi takes on IM Alice Lee for the 5th edition of Tani versus the World. Can he rise to the challenge and take down the third youngest female IM of all time? Fun Master Mike Klein and Women's FM Kinga Polak cover all the action at twitch.tv/chesskid. Use !Tani, !TANI in chat to learn all about it. Mark your calendars for August 28th, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, mark your calendars for 20 seconds from now, because the second match game in this decisive World Cup match between Carlsen and Praggnanandhaa is about to begin. And if you're Pragg, Peter, you're fighting two enemies at once. You're fighting Magnus Carlsen, but you're also fighting the position. You cannot allow it to get too dry or too drawish. Let's see what Pragg can offer us. E4 by Carlsen.
That's a kind of slight surprise for me. C5 obviously played, and C3. Magnus sticks to the Alapin, the strategy that Erigaisi used against Praggnanandhaa, which backfired. On the other hand, now already Magnus anticipates, he knows which setup Pragg is intending in a must-win situation.
And Magnus played it against Gukesh in their second match game. Carlsen winning with black and playing the Alapin in the second game. Gukesh was slightly better throughout that middle game, but Carlsen did get the kind of position out of the opening that he wanted. The Alapin Sicilian is known as one of the most solid systems, one of the most solid anti-Sicilians, and one of the hardest to break down and to generate imbalances against. If white is intent on making a draw in the Alapin, it's pretty hard to stop him.
Yes, and this is the first deviation compared to the Arjun Praggnanandhaa game. There, I think we have witnessed c takes d4, d6, bishop c4, and then knight b6, bishop b5, bishop d7. And that's where you revealed us all the secrets. No, it was David Howell. David Howell was revealing his secret games with Kasparov, of course. Was sensational stuff, but Magnus goes for bishop c4, and after knight b6, plays the move bishop b3. He wants to force Pragg into a completely different structure. I believe that the main theoretical move is d7, d5 here, when white can simply take e takes d6, queen d6, and the move knight a3, or maybe just capturing back on d4 gives white a very solid position.
Or even castle and kingside. I think in all those situations, you get a bunch of minor piece trades, and this is a very well-chosen opening by Magnus Carlsen. He knows that in order for Pragg to avoid the incredibly drawish lines that arise from the move d5 or d6, Pragg might have to take on c3, and that is an incredibly speculative move. Accepting the sacrifice here is wildly dangerous, and I think Pragg might go e6 here. He has to find some way to preserve some sort of imbalance, even if it means getting into a worse position. And that's actually why he's thinking, right? Normally, he would be blitzing out queen takes d6. As it stands, he's asking himself on every move, can I find any way to maintain an imbalance? No, he goes down the main line. And castle short by Carlsen. Here the main move is bishop e6.
Yeah, that's the professional move. The only problem is that bishop e6 might run into bishop takes e6, queen takes e6, knight takes. But hang on, how is this? Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen d4 is still kind of playable, right? After rook d8, there is some tension in the position.
This is a pretty old theoretical line. Sometimes black's queen actually goes into e2, if I remember correctly. I think queen f4 is considered to be the modern main line. White's queen can dive into c7, but something tells me Magnus will deviate before that position. Maybe after bishop e6, he wants to play with the immediate knight takes d4. Your idea, Peter, of knight to a3 is also on the menu for white. So something tells me Magnus has chosen strategically a line that essentially bails the game out, but it remains to be seen what exact line that is.
Yes, I'm a little bit confused because on the other hand, Yeah, this is a line that you want to make sure that if you already liquidate, it will guarantee you definite liquidation. You don't want to stay in the middle, that yes, it's kind of drawish, but it's still playable. Black has some chances. Is Magnus maybe having some very deep preparation, and after bishop e6, we might be seeing some very sharp knight ac, knight b5, and forget about liquidation. He just wants to make sure that black is on the defensive.
And I think Pragg, he's doing the right thing. He's testing the waters. It should be pointed out that bishop g4 would have run into bishop takes f7 check. I know this line, though. This is bad news for Pragg, Peter. Let's quickly show bishop g4, bishop takes f7 check, followed by knight g5, picking up the bishop. Unfortunately, the move that Pragg has chosen, I'm very well acquainted with it, and it leads almost directly to a virtually unwinnable position. Knight takes d4 is correct. And what often happens is knight takes d4, c takes d4, opens up the c3 square for white's knight. After black plays e6 and bishop e7, so I think the line goes e6, knight c3, bishop e7, queen f3. And I mean, we're not even talking about a bailout. We're talking about an advantage for white and an ultra solid position. White can push d5 on the next move and essentially force a favorable liquidation in the center. This is really bad news in the early going. And this is not any of Pragg's fault. I mean, what are you supposed to do against the Alapin?
Yes, it's simply that you shouldn't have lost the first game with white. Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, if the game would have been drawn, then Magnus would play a completely different type of chess. That would also give Pragg counter chances. Yeah, this is a chain reaction. Magnus also, he is so familiar with everything. Yeah, he has been in all kinds of situations hundreds of times. We have seen it in the Champions Chess Tour in the last couple of years that whenever Magnus got the lead in the match, it was no way stopping him. He knows exactly how to handle any situation. He knows his openings. He knows all these sidelines very well. It's a mammoth task for Pragg to do anything with this position.
Yeah, that position is just devoid of any kind of imbalance of any character. I think we are going to see queen f3 here. Of course, Carlsen could strike immediately with d5, but perhaps that would allow e5, just maintaining some form of intrigue in the center. Although even there, I think the knight can jump into b5, and at best, that seems like a very dubious option for black. But if I'm remembering correctly, queen f3 is the book recommendation. And unfortunately for Pragg fans, we might be seeing his last gasps in this event. Obviously the word unfortunately should be put in its proper context. Regardless of the result of this game, this will be the performance of Pragg's lifetime, and he will have his head held very high, as will all of his fans, as he exits the tournament hall. But too early to say. Magnus will count the chickens when they've hatched. He still has some work to do in this position.
The big question, what is he really playing for now? We know that all he needs is a draw, and you mentioned the book recommendation being queen f3, probably for the fact that white can even try to play for an advantage. On the other hand, the idea that opening up the center with d4, d5, no. And Magnus does play the move queen f3. He plays according to the demands of the position.
And queen takes d4 here is way too brazen. It allows queen takes b7. And the problem is that white ties himself to the bishop on e7. Black cannot castle kingside. And because black cannot castle kingside, the threat of knight b5 and knight c7 is absolutely devastating. So, yes, this is a way to unbalance the position. Queen to d7 here, also very important. Peter, white could even start with queen takes a8, but more precise is the immediate bishop a4, separating the knight from the rook. Knight takes a4 and queen takes a8 ends the game. It's just, there's just nothing that can be done here. If you're Pragg, you have to castle. And after d5, Magnus is not going to lose that game.
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate situation. You know that you need to win. You want to keep tension in the position. And castle on the board, played by Pragg. All eyes on Magnus. Will he play d5 or will he try to keep some tension?
Rook d1 also possible. Yeah.
This is the professional way of handling situation. You don't want to keep the tension if you only need a draw, making sure. And besides, it's a very unfortunate situation for Black. Black needs to play for a win. On the other hand, even if you ask me how does Black equalize, I would not be able to answer that question. White is just so much more harmonious with his queen on f3, knight c3, bishop on b3. After d takes e6, bishop f4 might come with a tempo, hitting that queen on d6. Just too many problems. Black even needs to be super precise to make sure that things are not escalating.
And I think they already are. This would be a dream position for Magnus in a regular classical game, much less in a situation where he can afford to bail out and make a draw. The problems for Black are manifold. First of all, the pressure in the center is massive. The bishop on f5 is an issue. It doesn't allow you to play the move e5, which you would really love to play. It doesn't allow you to take on d5. White's got many ways that he can develop his initiative. Bishop f4 is the obvious move with tempo, but pawn takes e6 and queen takes b7 is going to pick up a very important pawn on the queen side and maintain complete symmetry of the pawn structure. With the center pawns gone, that's what makes this position almost impossible for Black to win. There's no threats to create. There's no imbalance to create, and Magnus has his full complement of 25 minutes remaining.
For sure. It almost also feels to me that if Magnus would be in a must-win situation in this game, we would be also praising that, wow, what a chance. It's a golden opportunity because Black is under a lot of pressure. I do see the engine line, and the computer already suggests that a move like a7, a5 being the only move in the position to create some ideas. It's also connected probably with the pawn sacrifice, but let's forget about the pawn. It's much more important to get some counterplay.
I'm at a loss for suggestions here. I'm not seeing a single satisfactory move. I mean, even rook 8 to b8 came to my mind as a desperate way to try to keep the b7 pawn protected. Bishop f4 there can be met with e5. And, you know, bishop f4 does cut the contact between the queen and Black's light squared bishop. The issue is that Magnus has a vast menu that he can choose from. He can play rook e1. He can play pawn takes e6 and win the game immediately, because after bishop e6, now bishop f4 will skewer the queen and the rook and pick up the exchange. It's sad, you know, to watch Pragg. He's concentrating. He is trying his absolute hardest to find some way to keep the intrigue alive. But unfortunately for him, he's fighting a lost cause here.
Yeah, and the clock is ticking. No good options, no easy option at all. Not obvious what he should be doing. I do hope that out of desperation, he will come up with this computer move a7, a5. It's still the only move that I see.
And Pragg has been the consummate professional all tournament long. He has been faced with so many difficult situations. He's been faced with a must-win situation with the black pieces multiple times in his match against Arjun Aragaisi, and every time he responded with ever-increasing grit and professionalism. But this is an entirely different animal. Not only are you playing Magnus, but the position that you have is so devoid of winning potential. That's what we keep coming back to. And Pragg ultimately decides on the move bishop g6, which I like. His idea is that after pawn takes e6, f takes e6, at least he will open up the f file, and at least you're going to get some imbalance in terms of the pawn structure.
Yeah, it's probably a good practical choice. Now, black is setting up the threat of going e6, e5, and that would create that kind of tension in the position that is required for Pragnanda. Clearly, Magnus makes sure that the structure is fixed. D takes e6, f e6 on the board, and now I'm expecting queen e2 already played.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Just stability. Black has trouble defending the pawn on e6. Clearly, again, black has 3 pawn islands versus white's 2. Whenever we see these structures, I think it's very instructive to highlight that this is a big deficit in black structure. The only move to block that diagonal with knight d5 runs into different problems, and Pragg has opted for a pawn sacrifice with king h8 instead.
But the issue is that accepting that sacrifice also leads to a queen trade. Queen takes e6 here. would essentially force the queens off the board, because queen to d8 there runs into rook d1. And I mean, obviously, that is entirely counterproductive. Carlsen could also play rook d1, but I think having identified the queen trade, he will go directly for that position, and he already has. Again, even in a regular classical game, Magnus would kill to have such a position. He's not risking it all. This match is essentially over.
Yeah, one really has the feeling that this first dramatic game, which was a very intense battle, it could have gone either way. Finally won by Magnus Carlsen with a fantastic performance in time trouble, was the decided one. Here, with the black pieces, how do you hold the position? Not even talking about that black needs to win this.
No, I mean, you have to trade. White will proceed by developing his dark-scored bishop, likely to e3. And, you know, I would caution people against criticizing Pragg. If he offers a draw here, it's not for lack of effort. I mean, the one thing that you cannot criticize Pragg for this tournament is lack of effort. He has put every ounce, every iota of energy onto this chessboard. This event has lasted a month. And if he decides that he has no more winning chances, he might offer a draw here. And that would be an entirely understandable decision. There is just nothing left to play for in this endgame. Bishop e3 is going to be the dagger move, forcing the bishops off the board.
Yeah, bishop e3. Magnus is also sacrificing the pawn back, because after rook f8, he has bishop f7. Very important, making sure that you also trade off those bishops.
Yeah. Painful moments for Pragg. No matter who you're rooting for, you know, if you're a Magnus fan, you watch with sympathy. It's never pleasant. It's never easy to lose a final like this, but there's absolutely no shame. Hey, you lost to the greatest player in chess history. And how did you lose? You lost in a completely double-edged struggle that could have gone either way. You know, you had Magnus where you wanted him out of the opening. So for Pragg, zero shame, zero embarrassment. You know, to the contrary, he put up a monumental fight all the way to the end, but it looks like his time at the World Cup is coming to an end, and he will have to settle for the runner-up position.
It was also so nice to see him giving the interview yesterday after he realized that, yes, Magnus was not feeling well the last couple of days, that he really hopes that Magnus will be able to recover and show his best. That's the sportsmanship. Yeah, that's the Pragg. He's not trying to use some advantage on Magnus feeling not well. He wishes him the best, and he wants to beat Magnus at his best. It does seem like it isn't going to happen. Rook f8 on the board. I'm expecting the move bishop f7, but
Bishop
White
f7.
can also, but also White can fall back with the bishop to b3, saying that, you know what, I want to make sure that that knight from b6 will never start jumping to c4.
Indeed. Yeah, bishop f7 just forces the bishops up the board. Magnus still has all of the time that he started with, minus 30 seconds. But to come back to the graciousness demonstrated by Pragg as Magnus drops back to b3, he will give back his extra pawn, but in return, he will activate the rook from a1 and put it either on d1 or, even more to the point, on e1. This is what makes Pragg, I think, as well as the other Indian talents, so easy to root for. I mean, at 18 years old, the professionalism that he demonstrates on the board, but also off the board, you know, so gracious, so humble, great sense of humor. I think he's got all of the skills that he needs on the board, but once again, off the board, in order to have a long and illustrious chess career. And maybe one day in the not so distant future, a shot at the world title. And his journey will begin with a participation in the candidates tournament, where he has already secured a spot alongside Fabiano Caruana and, of course, Nijat Abbasov, who will play because Magnus Carlsen has turned down his participation already. So a lot of the credit goes to Pragg's family, his mom, who travels with him to the tournaments and worries over every game, and obviously the hundreds of thousands, millions of fans who watch every step that these exciting Indian players take and cheer them on. This is just the beginning for Praggnanandhaa. And this is finally the coveted World Cup title for Carlsen. It's taken him a long time, but it seems like he is only moments away from claiming the final feather in his cap.
Yeah, I think we have to mention for the viewers who are not that familiar with positions, that we would never dare to speculate about this kind of things if there would be real tension in the position. Black's
Yes.
problem is, however, that he's forced with the decision that he has to depart from his rook on e3. He can't play the move rook a8. Yes, and there is a handshake, rook takes e1, followed by a draw for nothing left to do.
And the players amicably discussing this game. Perhaps a quick discussion of the opening theory. A great choice by Magnus Carlsen to play the Alpen so heads up. He knew the theory, and after he played knight takes d4 and brought his queen out to f3, it started becoming clear that Pragg's winning chances were just non-existent. And in typical professional clean style, Magnus Carlsen secures victory at the 2023 World Cup. As we just said, the final feather in his cap, which had been eluding him for the better part of a decade. As he crushes the field, he wins so many iconic matches. He survives an incredible scare against Vincent Keimer. He wins a game on demand and now defeats Pragg in a scintillating rapid tiebreak to claim the World Cup title. But we still have one more game. Nijat Abbasov tries to do what Pragg could not and force a blitz tiebreaker with a victory over Fabiano with the black pieces. Let's go straight to that other game, having congratulated both Magnus Carlsen and his opponent on an amazing match, and Magnus on the World Cup title.
Yeah, obviously a fantastic achievement by Magnus. He wanted very much, that's why he came, that was his mission in Baku, and he seals it with a stunning performance. Very big congratulations from the whole chess world to Magnus. It was the only title missing in his incredible illustrious career. It's kind of insane to think about that something was missing, but that one has been fulfilled as well. And right here, what do we have? Some crazy action. Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces sacrificed a piece, but black is in a lot of trouble, and that piece will be taken back immediately.
Black is dead here. I mean, just look at black's king, white's queen on h5, hovering over the king like the sword of Damocles. And that last move, c3, tells us all that we need to know. It forks the bishop and the knight, but even if it didn't, the knight on d4 is paralyzed. It is pinned to the queen. So Caruana will have his choice of which minor piece to take. I think that we are on the cusp of a resignation here by Nijat Abbasov. Once again, to draw this game would be an absolute miracle. To win it is totally impossible.
Yeah, and again, we can admire the preparation level of the top players. Yeah, Magnus Carlsen and also Fabiano Caruana, knowing exactly how to handle these situations. They have so many weapons at their arsenal, and they can suddenly use the lines which they might not play in a classical game when they have the white pieces, because they want more than just stability. They want to win the game. However, at this moment, they can rely on solid lines, very sound lines, which require black to be perfectly precise in order to neutralize white's pressure. But that is not even an option for them. And that's why they are ending up in trouble, making also the task of both Fabi and Magnus then even simpler.
And Magnus's performance, the storyline that accompanies his victory, has dwarfed a lot of the other incredible performances that we've observed, but there have been many. Of course, Nijat Abbasov will have to settle for fourth place, but a trip to the candidates tournament nonetheless is a rather striking consolation prize, as well as a very hefty sum of money earned by Nijat, the hometown hero. But of course, Fabiano Caruana, so impressive, the way that he has resurged back to form, back to the form that we know that Fabi is capable of. Such clean play, such classy play as he dispatches Lenier Dominguez, and now Nijat Abbasov, and so many other very powerful players en route to claiming the bronze medal.
I also feel that since Nijat is clearly calculating, looking at ways how to stay in the game, gives us a chance to very quickly understand how did this happen, and we do see the Rosso Limo. We have been talking about that. This is the main weapon of Abbasov, but clearly he was afraid of Fabiano's preparation. That's why he deviated yesterday with e6 on move 2. And this is a very professional way from Fabiano. going for the main line of this Rossolimo, which is considered that, yes, black with very precise play might be able to equalize, but the knight jump with g4 is trying to spice things up. The main line clearly being c takes d4, knight takes d4, leading to a very solid position. I have to jump back to live action. c3, bishop d6, and c takes d4 had been played. White recaptures the piece, and still the king on f8 in a lot of trouble. The pawn on h6 is falling. White has all kinds of crazy ideas. The rook on d1 is in the game. The rook on a1 is already also eyeing the 7th rank. It's a total catastrophe.
Complete. Yeah, total calamity. e4 was played by Nishant, trying to keep the d-file closed, but this is a lost cause that he's fighting here. Rook a7, you could fill a volume with the winning moves. Fabi might choose to take on h6 and pocket that pawn. No, he does play rook a7. I think he's going to go down the best line, which is rook takes b7, and then sticking his knight on c5, hitting where it hurts. And once again, we might be just a couple of moments away from the conclusion of the final game here at the 2023 World Cup. This game is as over as it gets. Black is as dead as a doorknob.
It's hopeless. No, nothing to be done. The knight cannot really be tolerated. Yes, bishop d5 played a beautiful little last trap. Queen takes d5, seems to be winning on the spot. No, it loses on the spot due to bishop h2 check. Let me even put it on board. Bishop h2 check, king takes h2, queen takes d5, and suddenly black wins the queen.
Wow. It's never over till it's over. You just got to stay alert until the last move is played, until the score sheets are signed, until the handshake occurs. The simplest is bishop takes b5, because not only does that pocket a queenside pawn, but you're also threatening bishop to c6, deflecting black's bishop, and then it's white who wins black's queen in the event of a fork on e6. I wouldn't be able to play this a second longer, Peter, if I'm honest. Just looking at black's position elicits total disgust. This is just so nasty.
It's a total collapse. White even has rook a1, rook a7 ideas as well, if he wishes, but as you highlighted already, white is threatening to win on the spot. Black also can't really run away with his king to g7. That might even run into some queen g4 check, but the same idea with bishop c6 might be as effective as well, because after king g7, the fork issue with the knight check is still there.
Gosh. Yeah. Death has descended upon the black troops here. Everything is falling. Abbasov still trying, hoping against hope for a miracle, but miracles do not happen when Fabiano Caruana has 15 minutes on his clock in a +7 position. And again, you have to win this if you're Nijat Abbasov. He lost the first game. Fabiano Caruana, on the strength of a very unconventional opening, crushing Nijat Abbasov in a Trempowski, and now coasting to victory in style. You're pointing out knight d7, knight b6. That is the fastest way to end the game.
Yeah, it looks very tempting just to fork things. It isn't even obvious where black is running with his king after knight d7 check. King e7 would be the most natural, but then knight b6 not only eyes the queen, but also attacks the bishop, and then bishop will be captured with a check on d5. All right, you still have the move bishop f7, falling back, which leads to a catastrophic endgame. But Fabi might not even want this. He might feel that, come on, knight d7 check, king e7, queen f5, isn't it that? Game over on the spot. Is there a way to defend the f6 pawn?
Oh, yeah, that knight on d7, it covers the f8 square. You're right, queen f5 is the best move, and queen f5 might force immediate resignation. This might be the final move of the World Cup, queen h5 to f5 if Fabi uncorks it. But there are plenty of alternatives. Even queen takes h6 does exactly the same thing and picks up the pawn along the way.
Yeah, everything just wins. Black is completely doomed. Fabiano captures the pawn h6, keeps things simple. It's over.
Time to resign. And we expect Abbasov to extend his hand in resignation. There is nothing left to play for. The only move here is rook f8, and that simply gives up the exchange and allows white to trade the queens Abasov will make the ceremonial final couple of moves. Queen G7 check, I think, is the most clinical way to finish things off. And there it is, resignation. Queen H6 to G7, the final move of the 2023 World Cup, as Fabiano Caruana claims third place on a comeback victory over the hometown hero, Nishant Abasov, whose run at the World Cup deserves nothing but the highest praise.
Yeah, I believe that all four players should be extremely happy with their performance. Magnus Carlsen winning the World Cup, mission accomplished. Pragg being the runner-up, qualifying directly for the candidates tournament, playing an insane event, forcing Magnus Carlsen to the tiebreaks. And that first game was incredibly intense. I do believe that we will have chance to get interviews and we might be able to analyze that game. It was the deciding game of the World Cup, and Magnus Carlsen takes the trophy.
The World Cup is in the books. We congratulate Magnus Carlsen for his victory, Pragg for a second place finish, bronze medal claimed by Fabiano Caruana. The World Cup might be over, but our coverage is not. We will indeed try to get Fabiano Caruana on for an interview. We have plenty of chess left to analyze. We had an exciting 2 hours of action that we will unpack for you. But we're going to set everything up. We're going to go on another short break. And as the games conclude, don't go anywhere. You will not want to miss our debrief, our postmortem, and our interview with some players who turned in an incredible performance over the last month. You're watching the 2023 World Cup. Magnus Carlsen is officially the winner, and we will return with more postmortem analysis and an interview on the other side of this break.
So now we're going to try the Airthings memory test. 2 years ago in 2021, I tested Magnus's memory by setting up a bunch of famous positions and seeing whether he could recognize them.
Okay, this is the 24th game from Seville, obviously.
Now we're going to do the same, but with an added twist. We're not even going to be able to see which pieces are which. Every piece will be represented by an Airthings device instead. So let's see how Magnus gets on.
First of all, I'm thinking like, what are all these pawns on the last rank? But if I'm going to go piece by piece, I'm hoping that this is a king and these are pawns and that this is a bishop. And hopefully Queen H6 should be mated too.
2016, right?
Yes.
Carlsen against Karyakin.
So this test is called, has Magnus been following the World Championship? Ding is white against Nepomniachtchi. And here he could have taken the rook with the queen. Eventually, queen goes back here. King to d2. Queen b2. And eventually the king is running away. Ding should have found us then.
Is this any more difficult for you?
No, not really. The games are too famous, that's the problem. This has to be Kasparov Topalov from 99 Linares.
What characteristics make you recognize this position?
Maybe like it's just the structure on the queen side.
Nice.
Okay. So this one is one of my happier early chess memories. It's from the World Youth Championship under 14. I'm playing black in the first round against future Grandmaster Jonathan Hammer. That's the king over there. This and this checkmate. And this looks like checkers. So few pieces. But it's definitely a game I've seen, yeah? Almost.
It's. I don't want to give it away, but you will have. That's the clue. You will have seen it.
I'm not sure I've actually seen this.
Okay. In that case, I apologize. It's from the Queen's Gambit TV show when Beth plays, what's his name, Towns in her first ever tournament.
Oh.
And this is a rook, and it's trapped now because there's a knight on d4 and a king on d2.
Ah. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that sequence from the series now, but like I wasn't even close, to be honest.